I think the irony is that nobody's benefited more from it than the United States. The irony being that we benefit the most from basically having written a lot of these rules when we were the most powerful country.
Okay, well, this is our chance to get to ask some burning questions of Ben Rhodes.
Yes.
I'm Alyona Minkovski, Pod Save the World producer. He is
Ben Rhodes.
Ben
Let's
Rhodes.
light it up.
Okay, so for the people who listen to Pod Save the World every week, they know that we cover global news. You and Tommy give your expert analysis. You throw around a lot of foreign policy terms. You name institutions, alliances, events, so on and so forth.
We try not to be too nerdy, but I mean,
No,
you can
well,
get there.
you bring your expert
Yes, you bring our acronyms.
experience and opinions. And so I think that sometimes that learning curve might be steep for people who don't know a lot about foreign policy or are feeling a little timid about jumping into the game. Or maybe for the people who are worldos, they feel embarrassed to ask some of the most
or
basic.
They want to just go a little deeper.
Yeah, or okay, fine. I was
Yeah.
going to say basic questions, or maybe they just
Yes.
want to go deeper. This is both. This is both, people. I want to talk about something that we spoke about on a recent episode of Pod Save the World. It's also something that you mentioned in a recent article that you had in Foreign Affairs, which is great. I recommend everyone out there go read it, and it's called A Foreign Policy for the World as It Is. And you talk about how we need an updated conception of U.S. leadership, and you mentioned something called the rules-based international order.
Yes.
So you're saying that rules-based international order is basically
Doesn't exist
broken,
anymore. Yeah,
dismantled,
yeah.
doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Can you first just tell us what it is?
Okay. Well, if you listen to U.S. government officials, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is a good example of someone who you could play a drinking game for the number of times he says rules-based international order. So first, what is it? And then we can talk about why I think it doesn't really exist anymore. But, after World War II, essentially, the United States decided to build a whole set of rules and institutions that could kind of function as the system of geopolitics. How do countries get along? How do they solve problems? At the center of this whole enterprise was the United Nations. And the United Nations itself then has a lot of rules, like you don't invade other countries or violate their sovereignty. There are rules around human rights. There's a charter of human rights that are supposed to be respected under international law. And then there are all these different institutions and arrangements that come out of that. So, some of it is just services that are provided, right? The World Health Organization, the World Food Program. How do you deal with pandemics? How do you deal with refugee crises? All of that is connected to this rules-based international order. Then there are international laws, like you don't commit certain war crimes. Genocide is a crime against humanity. Extermination of populations, ethnic cleansing, things like that. Then there's also trade. How does trade function? And the World Trade Organization has a whole set of rules for how countries are supposed to deal with each other. But the way you should basically think about it is from World War II on, essentially, the United States kind of presided as by far the most powerful country in this system of institutions and rules that helped resolve disputes between countries and helped make sure that everything was running as smoothly as possible. Things are never smooth, but you have a place and a series of processes which to solve problems.
So let me ask you this. Is it fair to call it the rules-based international order, or is it more U.S. dominated? Did everybody want all of these institutions and these mechanisms for solving problems together, as you mentioned?
I think the one thing that everybody wanted is to not have another world war, right? And so that has been the largest success, really, of this whole enterprise, that no matter how bad things got, and there were other wars, and there were proxy conflicts and disputes between countries, but what has happened is there hasn't been another big war. And, for a big chunk of time, you had the Cold War, and so you had kind of two blocks of countries, the Soviet bloc and the U.S.-led bloc, that kind of negotiated with each other. So it's like you have your team, we have our team, and through all these institutions, we kind of negotiate arms control agreements to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, right? Or we find ways that we can collaborate on some things while disagreeing about others. After the Cold War, the U.S. really dominated things. And it didn't have absolute power, right? At the UN Security Council, which is kind of the most powerful group in this whole set of institutions and norms, China, Russia, they get a veto, so they could obstruct something. But the U.S. kind of got accustomed to dominating things. But, as I say in this piece, that's been unraveling for a long time now, a couple of decades now. Probably dates back to the beginning of the War on Terror and the Iraq War. And I feel like people in Washington, in both parties, candidly, have been slow to adjust to the fact that, we don't call all the shots anymore. And one of the reasons why is that for a long time we've basically said there's a rules-based international order in which the rules apply to everybody except the United States. We're very good at excusing ourselves from the rules.
Yes, therein lies one of the main problems, right? And so have who's benefited from the rules-based order, I guess, before it started coming apart, or as it's been a long, gradual progress, like you mentioned, that's taken place over decades, have there just been mixed results?
Well, I think the irony is that nobody's benefited more from it than the United States. The irony being that we benefit the most from basically having written a lot of these rules when we were the most powerful country. We continue to be the strongest military power, the biggest economy, the richest nation by a lot of measures. And yet, we act like these rules are such an encumbrance on us. There's been, in terms of what's kind of happened, I think the U.S. started to lose a lot of credibility around the Iraq War, which basically violated those rules. Invading and occupying a country is part of what the rules-based order is supposed to prevent, and that's what we did in Iraq. The War on Terror, we did not subject ourselves. People remember the prison in Guantanamo Bay. It was kind of basically setting up a whole extrajudicial system outside of the rules-based international order so we could do what we want. And we tortured people at Guantanamo Bay, and the whole world knew that. And so the excesses of the War on Terror challenged this. Then on the economic side, remember, for those of you who are old enough to remember, it was the U.S. that tanked the global economy in the financial crisis in 2008. And so then a lot of people said, well, the U.S. sets the rules and that the dollar is the world's reserve currency. We're constantly sanctioning countries because of that dollar dominance. We kind of set the parameters of trade and economic cooperation, and then we kind of tanked the whole system because our banks, were irresponsible, essentially. And so I felt in the Obama years like Washington wasn't calling the shots in the same way that kind of commentators in Washington, why can't you make this happen here or there? The other piece of it is that you had other nations, particularly Russia and China, decide to more aggressively challenge this whole system. And so Putin basically has been committed to destroying the rules-based international order for over a decade. The whole invasion of Ukraine challenges the fundamental premise that, a big nation doesn't just invade its neighbor, try to annex its territory. But Putin also, we're talking a few days after Putin went to North Korea, Russia voted through the UN to sanction North Korea, to not purchase arms from North Korea, to not engage in certain trade with North Korea. He's just flagrantly violating rules that he himself signed up to, right? And this is what Russia's steadily done, is act like there are no rules. We'll do whatever we want. We'll hack other countries. We'll, mount disinformation campaigns in their politics. And meanwhile, China has benefited from this whole dynamic because you've got the U.S. kind of undermining its own system. You've got Russia trying to destroy the system. And then you have China trying to build a new system, and they have their whole new set of organizations that they've set up. They've got an organization called the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And they've invited some other countries in. And they're basically saying, okay, you guys in the West, you have your clubs, like the G7 group of countries, which is the U.S. and a bunch of its key allies. We have our own club, and then we have our own economic institution. So this is the kind of strange place where we've arrived at, where the U.S. is still hanging on to pieces of the order that it likes. Russia's just trying to tear everything down, and then China's trying to build something new. And then we all sit around and talk about a rules-based international order that doesn't really exist anymore.
So I have so many questions coming from this, but let me just, because I'm trying to just get down to the basics and maybe play devil's advocate a little bit too.
Yeah.
Which is, one, does it matter? What are the effects? Are we completely fucked? Excuse my language. If the rules-based order falls apart, Or is the fact that it's falling apart really just a symptom of, of the fact that it wasn't working, and maybe it was poorly conceived, and maybe it needed to be reformed, and it's more natural for there to be different blocks, different regions, varied interests?
Let's break that into pieces, okay?
Yeah.
So, because those are really good questions. So, first, does it matter? I would argue that it does, and I'll give you a few examples. All the stuff we're seeing happening in the world now. Take the war in Sudan, right? This is something that is killing, hundreds of thousands of people, displacing millions of people, which, by the way, it matters to us in a humanitarian way, but it also matters. This is a part of a huge global migration picture that is driving people into Europe, that is making European politics more far right. There are all these ripple effects to these conflicts that end up coming into our own politics and society. Well, that's the kind of conflict that's happening because there's no place and set of institutions to kind of resolve it. You have, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, if you started to see a political crisis in Sudan that could lead to a civil war, and this, by the way, happened, you go to the UN, the Security Council passes a resolution calling for some kind of ceasefire and negotiated process. A bunch of diplomats go in, they set up some process of political negotiation, humanitarian aid gets in. Well, that can't happen anymore because the UN Security Council is kind of paralyzed by these differences. And so then what do countries do? They just start fueling what's going wrong. So you've got basically a proxy war in Sudan. You've got, the Emiratis and the Saudis backing essentially warlords fighting the Sudanese military who have their own backers. And it's kind of the law of the jungle there, right? Ukraine is obviously an example where this matters. A Russia that cared at all about the rules-based order, which it used to, even as the early Obama years, Russia wanted to be seen to be at least kind of pushing the boundaries, but still kind of playing within the lines. Well, because they're completely committed to just tearing this thing down, that's what allows them to say, we're going to invade this country and annex a chunk of it. I mean, that was unthinkable, at the height of the rules-based order that you would just, the Soviet Union didn't, it controlled countries, but the idea that they would kind of conquer territory and annex it, even the Soviet Union didn't do that, right? Now, that matters in all kinds of ways. I mean, the war in Ukraine, again, apart from the human catastrophe, has contributed significantly to inflation around the world, food shortages around the world, right? So politics, again, moving to the far right because of the inflation and greater refugee issues in Europe. And so this is all kind of ends up coming back to us. And, the more this continues, you've got a war in Russia and Ukraine, you've got a war in the Middle East, you've got a war in Sudan, and then you've got all these tensions in Asia. And the thing that the rules-based order was meant to prevent, a world war, suddenly feels uncomfortably possible,
I mean, first of all, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, right? A rules-based order will only work if everyone follows the rules.
Oh, but did it ever work, you asked? Yeah. And did it need to be changed? Sometimes I used to get annoyed when people say, the UN doesn't work. Well, the UN is the sum of its parts, right? And so it only works if people play by the rules. So one of the things I'm critical about in that article you mentioned is the U.S. supports the rules-based order in Ukraine, but not in Israel, for instance, right? And we basically are running interference for Israel against things like the International Court of Justice. So I would say, like, when people actually follow the rules, it tends to work pretty well. But I also think it had grown somewhat outdated. If you look at it, it's not very representative. So if you take the UN Security Council, again, the world's most powerful body, the 5 countries with a veto, China, Russia, the UK, France, and the United States. Well, that's kind of based on what the world was like in 1945, right? There's no representation for the global South. No India, no country from Africa, no country from Latin America. So part of what clearly needed to happen and still needs to happen is having the set of institutions kind of greater reflect the world as it is today. The G20 is not a bad example of a positive development. So again, for people who don't like hearing all these Gs, The G7's a pretty tight group, right? It's a bunch of European
Ben,
countries.
I just have to say, by the way, these are like lots of other episodes that you're getting into right now.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm saying...
But I think it's a good teaser. Let people know. We can do a whole one about the UN Security Council. We can do one about the G7, the G20, what they are and why they matter. But this is a great teaser.
The only quick point I want to make is if you look at the G20, it's a venue for resolving global problems, particularly economic ones. India's there, Brazil's there, Indonesia's there, South Africa's there. So, that's kind of what you need to see is more countries at the table. The problem is, right now, there are just these different collections of countries solving or trying to solve problems on their own apart from one another. And at some point, this has to all kind of be threaded back together.
Sounds like a case of really poor management at this company called the World that we all live in.
The board for the world includes Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, Bibi Netanyahu. When you have a bunch of nationalist authoritarians, and hopefully we won't add Trump to that list, the institutions function as a reflection of the national politics.
Sounds like a poorly run company. A lot of like really mediocre and probably even evil dudes who have failed upwards.
A shitty board.
We all know a thing or two about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the rules-based order has fallen apart. It only works if we all follow the rules, and it needs to be reformed. Is there a new, world order that we need, or kind of like where do we go from here? If you can say that quickly.
I think quickly that, first is do less harm, right? And so I think people need to kind of redouble efforts. In the Cold War, it was a goal to avoid World War III. Like that should be a goal again, like in our relations with big countries. But then what I would say is that, okay, you've got these different pieces of the puzzle. You've got the U.S. kind of, led bloc, call it what you want, the free world, advanced democracies, advanced economies. Then you've got the Chinese bloc. Then you've got all these countries in the middle, right? Like, Turkey and India and the Gulf Arab states. They kind of negotiate between the two. I think this all has to turn into a kind of negotiation where, people are beginning to, on the big questions, right? Climate change, artificial intelligence, obviously conflict. There's a greater focus on kind of negotiating between different groups of countries around how to solve these problems. And then through those negotiations, you're kind of building new norms and institutions for how do you deal with these new issues like climate, like artificial intelligence, and the old issues like conflict. And so it's kind of getting the world back on a track of negotiation and diplomacy rather than conflict and, permanent competition.
That would be nice.
That would
Personally,
be nice.
personally, I would really prefer that we don't go into a World War III scenario and that we get to, scale it back and see the Rhodes Doctrine come to life, where everyone believes in diplomacy.
We don't kill each other. Yeah.
Okay, so now before we wrap, and again, I feel like you gave us some other good ideas for future episodes too, with like AI and kind of global regulation conversations that are happening. We can talk about climate conferences, but before then, we're going to play a game. I'm going to put 30 seconds on the clock, and I'm going to give you a like a pop culture story, and you have to make it in 30 seconds or less into a foreign policy story. Are you ready?
I think so.
Okay. It's just
and I don't know these questions.
I hope you're read up on your foreign policy.
I know, that's what I'm worried
pop
about.
Culture.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not even a question. I'm just going to say Justin Timberlake's DWI in the Hamptons. Go.
Oh, JT in the Hamptons. I'd say that's basically like the Tory party heading into the election in the UK. The sign that, maybe you took a bad turn and you did, you probably developed some habits you need to get rid of, and your success in the past can't save you from accountability. And I say that liking JT, but...
Wow. Well done. That was we just wrapped at 33 seconds, but I feel like you missed the most obvious one, which maybe you didn't see this from the story, which is the cop who arrested Justin Timberlake. I'm sorry to make light of this situation.
He didn't know who he
This
was
is
because he was so young, right?
Yeah. Insiders told Page Six that he didn't recognize him because he was so young.
Yeah.
And another insider told Page Six that Justin had said under his breath, "This is going to ruin the tour." And the cop replied, "What tour?" And Justin said, "The world tour."
That especially
Think of the
hurts
fans.
because, again, I like JT, probably dating myself, but also Trolls World Tour was a big movie in my house. So I know he wasn't referring to Trolls World Tour, where he was the voice of Branch, of course, for all the parents in the house. But it did ruin the World Tour.
It's okay. You guys, I may have had a Justin Timberlake poster or two in my room as a
In
tween,
sync or
too.
solo artists? I guess you're a little older.
I mean, it started with my love for NSYNC, and I was like vehemently opposed to my friends who liked the Backstreet Boys more, and then it turned into an embrace.
Well,
of
you were
his-
right about that, I think.
Yeah,
Right? Yeah.
still am.
Backstreet's
All right,
back.
we're gonna leave
Backstreet's
it there.
back, maybe.
But Ben,
Is
this was,
Backstreet or the Backstreet Boys
Is
the Labor
Backstreet
Party
back?
in this analogy, or the Backstreet Boys the Labor Party?
I don't want to make them the good guys.
Yeah, it's true. We should make them good guys.
All right, Ben, this was fun. Thanks for doing it.